Good morning and welcome to this information session all about AGMs. My name is Karin Schulter and I'm one of the directors at ShareSoc. We have quite a few new attendees this morning, so I just wanted to remind everyone about ShareSoc. ShareSoc is a not-for-profit organisation run by investors for investors. We represent the interests of individual investors throughout the UK. And as you can see from this slide, ShareSoc is very active in many areas. And one key area which we see as very important is about exercising the right to vote at AGMs. Now to the ShareSoc disclaimer. As many of you know, ShareSoc does not provide investment advice, and individual investors are encouraged to do their own research prior to making investments or adjusting any positions. Today's session will last 1 hour, and there will be a presentation followed by an example of the Minerva voting information for Lloyds. Please feel free to ask questions. Any questions that you type into the question box can be seen by all attendees. If you have a similar question or like that question, you can choose to give it a thumbs up. And the more thumbs up the question receives, the higher it goes up the question list. And this helps me ensure that I'm focusing on the questions that matter. I will now introduce our panel. This morning, we are joined by Sarah Wilson, founder and CEO of Minerva Analytics, the UK's independent ESG research and proxy voting agency. Sarah will explain the role of Minerva during her presentation. Good morning, Sarah.
Good morning. Thank you very much.
We are also joined by Maureen Beresford. Maureen is Head of Corporate Governance, Reporting and Governance Division at the Financial Reporting Council, the FRC. Thank you for joining us today, Maureen, despite being on holiday.
Hello, everybody.
We are also joined by ShareSoc Founder Director and Mello Events Founder, David Stredder. David has many years of experience in investing and is an active participant at AGMs. Good morning, David.
Morning.
And lastly on the panel today is Cliff Waite. Cliff is a ShareSoc director and heads up ShareSoc's policy and campaign area. Cliff has been an investor since 1984, and he is also author of the Director's Remuneration Handbook. Good morning to you all. Thank you for making time for this session. Prior to the presentation, ShareSoc would like to know a little bit about you, the attendees' experience regards AGMs. So we have a couple of polls. The first will be held now and the second will be held after the presentation. It should be appearing on your screen, and it's asking you if you typically vote or regularly vote at AGMs. So if you could state which relates to you, that would be appreciated, and we shall put the answers up shortly. So we can see that votes are still coming in. Still got a couple more people to vote if that's possible. Amanda, can you show the results, please? Are the results on the screen?
Yeah.
Yes, well, that's very interesting. So do you regularly vote at AGMs? 48% yes and 52% no. So we've got 50-50 there. And that's quite pleasing, actually, because often it is the case. Sometimes we find that not as many people as often would vote at AGM. So that's a very engaged audience. Cliff, I'd now like to hand over to you to start the presentation.
Thank you and good morning. Companies are owned by shareholders. AGM is an abbreviation for Annual General Meeting. Every company has to have an AGM at which shareholders, that's members of the company, vote on important matters. Shareholders have to approve the report and accounts. shareholders have to elect directors and auditors. These and other matters, including shareholder questions, make up the formal part of the AGM. Good AGMs will have presentations and videos from management about the company, its strategy, business model, operations, risks, and outlook. Many companies organize webinars prior to the AGM, and you can ask questions at these webinars, and that's all part of the engagement process. Or you can ask your questions at the AGM. And I prefer to actually send in my questions to the company secretary before the AGM to give the company a chance to prepare a detailed and thoughtful answer. It's not everybody's approach. Some like to surprise the chairman with a question on the day. Can we go to the next slide, please? Shareholders have to be sent a voting form, a letter about the AGM and the resolutions, and a copy of the annual report. And here's an example of RBS, who send you all this lovely information. Here's my copy here. Isn't it great? And shareholders get all that information unless they opt out. Can we go back to the previous slide, please? Now, the thing is, the nominee structure means that many people hold their shares via a nominee, and so they're not actually shareholders. And that's why we have our shareholder rights campaign, to try to improve the rights of shareholders who hold shares this way. Now, not all the platforms actually send you information about AGMs, and that's a real problem. So that's the key issue here. And let's go on to the next slide, the next but one slide, please. That's the one. If you want to vote at an AGM, what do you actually have to do? Well, with Interactive Investor, I use Interactive Investor as my platform. And so you go into the main screen and you go into portfolio, and then there's a box there which you can see highlighted with a pink blob next to it, voting mailbox. So Interactive Investor sends you an email each time there's an AGM notified, and they send you this link so that you can get information. In this case, you get about NatWest, the old RBS. And if you click through there, if you want to vote in favor of all the resolutions, you just click one box, and this is a 2-click process to vote your shares. Couldn't be simpler. If you want to vote against some of the other resolutions, you click through to the next screen and you just click the boxes. So it's a 30-second operation to vote your shares. That's Interactive Investor. If only it was so easy via the other platforms. Hargreaves Lansdown, who are not my favorite platform at the moment because of what they did to investors in Woodford, they make it really quite difficult. And AJ Bell are the same. And one of these two, I think they actually require you to send a text of what your voting instructions are. I mean, how prehistoric can you get? So that's the voting issues and how easy it is. Our platforms. Let's go on to the next slide, because the AIC have done a very good survey, very helpful survey. There's the link at the top of the page, because you may not be able to see the detail of this, but basically on their site, they go through each of the platforms and explain whether you're going to get the AGM information and how easy it is to vote and how you go about it. So that's well worth looking at. I think I'll hand back now to Carlin. Thank you.
If we could move forward to Maureen's presentation.
Hello everybody, I'm Maureen Beresford and I'm Head of Corporate Governance at the Financial Reporting Council. And I just wanted to give you a little update on what we've done on AGMs last year and what we're doing this year. Okay, moving on. So last year, as you probably all know, there was problems with AGMs and whether retail shareholders could attend. And you're probably thinking, well, what's the Financial Reporting Council got to do with that? So the Financial Reporting Council issues the UK Corporate Governance Code, and that's relevant for all premium listed companies. And we have a principle in the code which says, and I'll read it out, in order for a company to meet its responsibilities to shareholders and stakeholders, the board should ensure effective engagement with and encourage participation from these parties. And as the pandemic took hold last year, we were receiving calls from a number of organisations such as ShareSoc and individuals, and even Minerva, telling us that, you know, lots of meetings were being closed to shareholders. It wasn't easy to ask questions of companies, etc., etc. So we thought we'd do a quick review of what was going on and see how companies were actually meeting their the requirements of the UK Corporate Governance Code. And so we did a review, and as you can see from the slide, you know, we saw that practices didn't support shareholder engagement. It was very difficult times, but not a lot of effort was being made by some companies to actually ensure that retail shareholders in particular were not disenfranchised. And as part of that review, we also looked at the use of technology. You know, were virtual meetings or hybrid meetings, which is a mix of virtual and physical meetings, something that companies were actually thinking about doing. And also we thought, well, maybe going forward, there's something in here. Maybe the AGM is a little bit of a dinosaur concept. Should we change it? Should there be a different approach? And we thought about, what about other stakeholders? Should they be more involved as well as shareholders? So what happened was we issued our review in October last year. And, you know, they're the issues we considered. As you can see from the little table on the side, 80% of the companies that we looked at had a closed meeting, which made it difficult for shareholders to engage. Next slide, please. What we also included in our review was some best practice. I've not listed it all, but I thought you'd be interested in some of the key commentary that we gave, which was, you know, make sure there's a dedicated area on a company website. There are clear instructions about voting, about attending AGMs, how to submit questions. You know, Cliff said he likes to write in early. Some people want to have a question on the day. One of the issues that came out was about grouping questions, you know, telling the individual shareholder on what basis their question might be grouped, so they fully understand what's happening. And also, you know, if you submit a question and it's not as asked on the day, well, perhaps, you know, there's a good argument for the transcripts to be available and all the questions that we're submitting to actually receive a response. So we covered these issues, as you can see on the slide, in our best practice guidance that was attached to our review. But that's not where we stopped. We thought there was more to this, as I said earlier, and we thought we ought to think about going forward. Next slide, please. So we actually thought about what companies should do for this year. So we thought about telling companies that they should do, you know, prepare early. You know, we didn't think this time last year that the pandemic would still be going on and there would be closed meetings, but, you know, we hoped that companies would prepare early just in case. Consider whether articles of association need to be changed, because, you know, not all companies could have an effective hybrid meeting or even move to a virtual meeting, which might have been appropriate for some of the smaller companies that didn't have so many shareholders. We told companies to engage quickly with their registrars to ensure that they could meet the maximum number of shareholders, even if they had to have some kind of hybrid meeting. And get to grips with the technology. I think last year a lot of companies were scrabbling around because they were, you know, only used to a full AGM with physical participation and not using the benefits of technology, like, you know, maybe a director's in the US or in Australia, getting them to call in, even if we weren't subject to any restrictions this year. There are lots of flexibilities that technology can offer, whether or not we're in some kind of difficult pandemic situation, as we still are. And ensure that the plans are communicated effectively to all your shareholders. Next slide, please. What we've also done is we started a stakeholder group, and as you can see from the members, ShareSoc is on that group, as is Share Action, but also representatives of companies GC 100, Governance Institute for company secretaries, etc. And what we're trying to do is to look at the AGM going forward, whether there needs to be legislative change, and we think there does need to be legislative change because it's not clear how companies can fully embrace technology. We know that retail shareholders, although you generally like to attend the meeting, you can't be in two places at once. So maybe technology is useful for kind of dipping into one AGM and dipping into another. Or if you live in, I don't know, north of England or Scotland or Wales, etc., most meetings are held in London. So, using that technology to kind of stop the need for actually attending every single meeting, and also adding to carbon footprints, which is, an issue of the day. So we want clarity in the Companies Act. We want to consider the format of the AGM, how to kind of get issues such as climate, stakeholder issues, consider at the AGM or prior to the AGM, or at least make sure that all individual investors have access to what companies are doing in this space. So we're going to propose a best practice guide for all companies, but also probably extend that to investors and others that are interested in AGMs, so that there's a starting point for everybody to build upon. And this will include the technology point that I mentioned earlier. We expect to report in the autumn, so I'm sure that Cliff will update you when we're doing that, and he might even share some of the information with you prior to that. And I think that's the end of my slides. Just check there's not another one, please. That's it. So thank you for your time. If you've got any questions, I'd be happy to answer them later on.
Thank you very much, Maureen. I'd like to hand over to Sarah Wilson now, who'll give us some more information about Minerva Analytics.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And it's a great pleasure to be with everybody here today. So we've heard a little bit about the mechanics of voting your shares and why you should do it. So I would now like to turn to the underlying issues that actually go into thinking about how you do your voting at AGMs, and actually what goes into making an informed voting decision. So as mentioned at the beginning, Minerva is providing support to ShareSoc with research reports. So I thought I'd just give a little bit of an explanation about what we do and how we do it and why we do it, to put this into context. So Minerva's role is to give investors the tools and the data that they need to become informed stewards of their portfolio holdings and to enable them to make intelligent voting decisions. And that comes from providing three interlocking components: an electronic voting platform. This is something that we've been operating since first proxy season in 1996. A comprehensive database of directors and companies, remuneration and governance practices of companies around the world, and research reports that we produce for each AGM, which all sounds terribly simple. But if you've ever picked up a 250-page annual report and tried to make your way through investor presentations on their websites, I think you'd probably disagree. So our role is to enable the avid reader of annual reports, who often find them very dense and disconnected. Even our own experienced analysts often find them quite infuriating, which is why the FRC's got this ongoing mission for better disclosures and joined up disclosures. Things are getting more complicated each year. There's more in the annual report. So it's not surprising that people feel intimidated about voting. So what we do is try and take all of that complexity and drill it down into a framework of good practice, or good, better and best practice, which is based on, first of all, the UK Governance Code. We also look at the OECD principles. Those are supranational bodies who think this is what is needed from companies to be effective over the long term. The International Corporate Governance Network, company law, and investor guidelines. So that basically creates the framework for us as we're analysing to produce vote guidelines. 70% of this work takes place between March and May. So Maureen's comments about not being in two places at one time is absolutely crucially important, because AGMs are taking place at the moment while there is an avalanche of annual reports coming through the door as well. So I'm absolutely delighted to hear that the FRC is going to basically enhance guidance and make recommendations to companies to make AGMs more accessible. And we do this for about 6,500 companies. And what we're looking for on behalf of our investors are clear explanations of and accountability for a board's actions across a range of governance dimensions. We produce an AGM report, which looks at the resolutions, and then 2 sub-reports looking at the remuneration, and also, very importantly now, the sustainability and the climate change governance issues. But what we don't do is produce investment research. That's actually something that is obviously falls more naturally to your stockbroker. We're looking to see that the companies are adhering to good practices, and if they're not, presenting options for how people might want to vote, whether it's against the annual report, against the chair of the audit committee, the remuneration committee. There's a range of those issues, and Cliff's now going to talk through how our research gets turned into a voting recommendation. So I'm going to hand over now to Cliff.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Actually, just before we hand over to Cliff, we're going to do another poll.
Oh,
and I think, Amanda, if you could put the poll up on the screen, please. This will be a poll about the information you receive and if you regularly receive information on AGMs. So I know what Cliff was saying with Interactive Investor, it's quite a straightforward process, and we know with some of the other platforms and brokers, perhaps it's not so straightforward. So we want to see if this is similar to how the first poll went. We're just waiting for a few more votes to come in. And Amanda, if you could publish the poll, please. So we also have a pretty 50-50 situation there, which is very similar to the first poll, and does show that, you know, half of you are getting information regularly about AGMs, which is good, but obviously there's room for improvement. Amanda, if you're able to put up the Lloyd's example, and Cliff, if you could take us through, that would be great.
Okay, can you see me? I've got to start my video. Okay, first of all, I just realized I omitted something in what I was saying before. With Interactive Investor, first of all, you have to opt in to receiving all that voting information, and that's on the that initial screen I was showing you. So you have to opt in to receive the information. Okay. Lloyd's Banking Group, if you owned the shares in 1998, they were worth £5 a share in today's equivalent. So you would have lost 95% of your money invested, well, less any dividends you got. So this highlights how important the whole issue of governance is. And the big value destroying activity was when the board took over HBOS in 2008-9, and it is allegedly done without proper due diligence. That was then a rights issue of 13 billion with allegedly illegal lack of disclosure of relevant items, and the judge recently said it should have been disclosed. So these issues of corporate governance and how companies communicate with their shareholders are absolutely crucial, and this is a classic case of a woefully performing company. So I think those are the key points to highlight. This is actually, you know, you would have thought a bank would be a sort of a Granny's share. There's a really safe dividend share, but no, actually, Lloyd's is more like a casino stock. It was 24p on September last year. I looked this morning; it's now 48p, and so it goes up and down a bit like a yo-yo. So where are we? Let's go and look at the Stocko report, please, because in our standard report, which we just showed you our standard report, which we do for the largest companies, we have 4 key items of information. Sorry, this isn't that easy to see, but it highlights the share price decline, and it also highlights the income decline. And I think it's going from it's 43 billion revenue in 2019, forecast this year for 15 billion, and a similar amount for next year. So this is a bank which is shrinking very substantially. So that's the Stocko report. Let's go on to the next. Oh yes, that's fine. This is the voting demos from Minerva Information. These are the 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 key pillars which they look at. I think they look at several hundred different pillars, and which resolutions these are relevant to. So that's key information there. And if we go back and then go to the next slide, that's the one, thank you. And Minerva have an algorithm. Algorithms are a word which is a little bit out of favor nowadays, but this is a proper good algorithm, and they can set it up so as to highlight the issues and generate some voting and guidance. And in this case, the guidance is in red for some, and the reasons shown why. So that's the headline. And if we go back now to the fourth thing, there's a detailed 22-page report which Minerva write on each company. If we just slide down a little bit on this page, please. Here we go, up a little bit, up a fraction, governance, that's it, but no, sorry, down a little bit. Can we see the remuneration? That's fine, that's about. So the issues about dividends, it's a small percentage of cash flow, so why not higher dividends? I think there's a technical issue here, the FCA of restricted dividends. Political donations, 100,000 authority, that's highlighted. And I think when we did a report for BAT, the Minerva report highlighted it. I'm not sure it was 16 million or what of political contributions in America. So this is an interesting, important issue. And there's lots of items of concern about remuneration. There often are, because remuneration is such a contentious issue. And this is this just highlights them. There's a more detailed report behind that. But I just wanted to highlight a couple more points. If we go, I think it's page 3, isn't it, Amanda? Halfway down page 3, we see, here we are. Yes, this is a useful thing. The market cap of the company. This was a 50 billion market cap in 2017, and it halved by December 2020. So the directors have adopted a strategy which has lost 25 billion pounds of shareholder value. COVID obviously caused a lot of this issue, but that is a very important statistic. If we go down a little bit further, we've got this. I think that did we just go past it? No, this is a little bit further on. So sorry, Amanda knows where she's going better than me. So it's just the top of the next page about share buybacks. Here we are, and this highlights a 5-year trend. I think it's very important. I'm rather anti-buybacks because companies aren't very good at it. In 2018, they spent £1 billion of shareholders' money buying back shares at 63 pence. And by the end of the year, the share price was 52 pence. That's pretty poor. And not learning from their mistakes, they bought back some more in 2019. And as I said, when the price went down to 24p, and they didn't buy back any. So there are lots of different issues which the Minerva reports highlight, but I thought people listening would be interested to hear about those too. And also from that, how we extract some voting recommendations for you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cliff. While we've got that up on the screen, Sarah, would there be any additional comments or things that you would like to show the attendees about the Minerva reports?
Thanks very much for that. No, I think the Cliff has actually covered the bases actually quite well in terms of the way that we are systematically flagging all of these points. And there's a question that's come up in the Q&A, which I think is actually very relevant to address here, if I may, which is, oh, if institutional investors do all of this voting, why should retail investors bother? And the answer is because, well, why does anybody bother voting in any kind of election? Because it's the weight of the votes that is important, and retail investors are sort of 20–30% of shares held, and your views are very important. You're not conflicted often in the same way that institutional investors are. So what these reports are doing is empowering the retail investor to have at their fingertips exactly the same information that institutional investors may have, but sometimes are not always empowered to be able to vote on. Sometimes they can't actually, for a whole reason of conflicts of interest, or maybe preferring different strategies. So yeah, do use the data. It's comprehensive, and we've tried to make it as plain English as possible. And from that perspective, it does make a difference, because companies actually need to be able to see that investors actually have strong feelings about these issues, and it creates a very positive feedback loop with companies.
Yes, thank you very much. And that is a question that's come up, you know, how well heard is the retail investors' vote? And David, we haven't heard from you yet. What would your views be on that?
Well, you know, I think we've got to straight away see the difference between all companies. One size doesn't fit all. And, you know, when we say institutional holders make up a large percentage of a company register, it isn't true at every company. You know, I'm invested in a lot of smaller companies, and there the institutions are not the majority. Quite often it's the retail investor that's the majority. And, you know, if we say it's not worth, well, we're not saying that, but if people feel it's not worth voting, then actually they were the majority in that situation, and their vote really would have counted. So it's very important that everybody uses their vote and uses it wisely, of course. I don't think everyone feels the need to attend an AGM, but personally I've attended hundreds over the years, and I learn more at an AGM about a company than I do reading just an annual report, because you're getting to see the mentality of the directors, who drives the board. You get the chance to ask questions to the non-exec directors. And of course, the non-exec directors you wouldn't see at all if you didn't go to an AGM. They don't attend anything else, don't usually attend any presentations the company makes. And I think the key as well is that if you think a company is just the chief exec, then of course you're very wrong. There's a lot more behind a company than just the chief exec. And it's usually the chief exec that you have contact with if you're keen and you ring up a company and ask a few questions. So you do need a balanced viewpoint of where the company's going. And it's the AGM that you have the big opportunity for that.
Thank you, David. I mean, it is very important, and Maureen, through your presentation, we saw that as well. And it's great to know that the FRC are facilitating and investigating how the situation can be improved. And, you know, coming to sort of hybrid AGMs, and I guess the pandemic having highlighted first the move for virtual in total, and now maybe coming out of the pandemic hybrid. How do you see that progressing? Obviously, for a number of companies, in order to facilitate this, they would need to change their articles of association. So does this affect the majority of companies? Should we be seeing a lot of changes in articles of association to affect this? Sarah, I see you shaking your head. So it would be good to understand this, because I think this is often frustrating. So Maureen and Sarah, please, I'll enjoy your views on that.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. One of the things to note is that there has always been in company law, case law, about the use of hybrid technology in meetings. And this actually first came into being back in the 70s in overspill rooms with CCTVs, if everybody remembers what a CCTV is, rather than a webcam. We saw around Europe and around the rest of the world is that regulators acted very quickly to provide clarification, but said that actually new law was not needed. But where there is new law needed, I think, is to ensure that protections are actually really baked in. But we have heard terrible practices of people not being able to ask questions and things like that. And so I think a general law change about the conduct of meetings to really bake in shareholders' rights that are sometimes being forgotten is absolutely critical. And I just wanted to make the point that David made. David made a very important point there about what you normally hear from the CEO, who is trying to sell you an increased share price, whereas the non-executive directors and the rest of the board are there to ensure good governance of the company. So it is very important to remember that you, as owners of these companies, you've got rights. You are appointing the non-executive directors to be your stewards of the company, and so they are accountable to you. And what's needed is a reinforcement of that fact that the AGM isn't a sales process, it's an accountability process. So that's where we do very much support clarification of the law, but it's not ultra virus to have an internet-based AGM under the current legal construct. But I'm looking forward to seeing what the proposals are going to be.
Maureen, your views on that?
I think lawyers from the largest companies are in some disagreement about how far the current legislation will allow companies to go fully virtual. And the articles of association for many companies do need to be amended because they're based on a purely physical meeting. I think there'll be lots of changes, and there are changes this year where companies have managed to change their articles to go hybrid. But I think to move purely physical, that the lawyers would want some additional support from the Companies Act and some tweaking of the legislation to make them comfortable with the position. And that's what they've told us as part of our review. So we'll be suggesting changes to one or two of the sections of the Companies Act to ensure that, one, there's clarity on the position. Sarah mentioned case law, and some lawyers will argue that, yeah, you can do whatever you want now, but I think we need clarity. But also there are concerns around fully virtual meetings. The last thing we want to see is that all companies go fully virtual and then potentially do closed virtual meetings without a physical element at all. So I think what we're discussing at the moment is the parameters around any legislative change that firmly state that virtual is an option and can be used, but what does that mean? Do you need to get the agreement of your shareholders to do that? What rules should be around a fully virtual meeting? I think what we'll see going forward is lots of hybrid meetings because they're best of both worlds, I think. And I think it's really important, the points that David and Sarah made, the board should be there and be accountable to shareholders, and institutional investors can attend AGMs if they want to do, and all sorts of shareholders attend, particularly if there are issues that they're concerned about. They will attend and they will voice their views. And I think that's highly, it's really, really important that that doesn't change, that, there is that forum where you can actually go to a meeting, make your points clearly and succinctly, and that others can listen to those points, because you might be raising issues that others have not actually thought about. As Sarah said, going through the annual report is a bit of a chore, and whatever she can do and others to help is great, but you might not pick on individual issues. And seeing how the board respond to those views, the comments from the floor, I think is absolutely something that can't be replicated, and we should defend that.
No, Yeah, good points. We're going to move on to nominee accounts in a minute, but just before that, just to clarify, so Lloyds have got their AGM on the 20th of May. They have a shareholder information session on the 13th of May. This is via webinar. And one of the reasons why we timed today's session prior to that, in case people want to sort of be prepared or ask how best to do it through this session. Do you see, Maureen and Sarah, as that as a good progression, that yes, there is the AGM on the 20th. I don't believe it's fully interactive. Therefore, they have this session on the 13th for shareholders to ask questions.
I would much rather see everything happening in the AGM, to be perfectly honest. Sorry, Maureen, a slight lag on the line there.
I think there are lots of different approaches that companies will take. And our view of the FRC is that the more engagement with all shareholders, the better. If that's at the AGM, that's great. If because of COVID, then it's a couple of days beforehand, that too is great. You know, I think we need to shift our view that engagement isn't a end of the year event. It's an event that should happen throughout the year with your shareholders and with your stakeholders. I think stakeholders are becoming more and more important. I think we need a way to get the information that companies are gleaning from their discussions with environmental specialists or suppliers, etc., back to the shareholders, so that they have more information that enables them to vote effectively. And if that's by having a meeting 3 days before, then I think that's fine. I think there'll be a lot of change over the next few years, and then things will settle down. But I do think it's really important to have as many engagement opportunities as possible.
Yes, so, and obviously during the pandemic, we've seen that companies have gone online a lot more with webinars about them. I mean, you could say there are sales pitches, but at least there is more opportunity to interact with them. And that is an interesting outcome of the pandemic. But of course, they are no substitute for an AGM. Sarah, I don't know if you want to make another point before we move to nominee accounts.
So this actually just joins up very nicely with what Maureen was saying earlier about new guidance, etc., and the need for clarity about this, because lawyers are very good at, if it hasn't been written down, it's not allowed approach to things. The AGM is minuted. Shareholder meetings of a general kind are not. And so from that perspective, that's why I said I want to really see a lot of these things happen in the meeting, because otherwise it becomes it has the potential to become a very stage managed approach. And we've seen a number of companies in the last 2 years who've had more than 20%, more than 30% dissent at their AGM on certain resolutions, and actually taking no steps to address that. And so there is a balance of power problem between investors and the board, who are sadly, not everybody, you know, the majority of companies do a good job of their communications, and they do provide high quality meetings, but there are always some that spoil it for the rest. And it creates bad precedents, which I think is very unfortunate. So I've seen a number of the questions coming up in the Q&A about why do I not get my questions answered, and what do we do about this? And I think this is actually crucially important. It's a forum for accountability at the AGM. An engagement meeting is not a forum for accountability. And I think that there sometimes are some extremely serious issues. For example, we've had illegal dividends paid, for example. We've had directors who have their companies have been involved in acts which have resulted in massive fines, but there has been no exercise of the malice or clawback. That means having to repay on the remuneration, or people getting paid off large sums of money when the company's, you know, been an absolute basket case. So it's horrible sometimes to focus on the negative, and it's like we never say thank you to companies for doing a good job, but it's inevitably, we don't want rotten apples spoiling the whole barrel. And there is a real risk, and we've seen this in America, where you have companies who make AGMs inaccessible, starting at difficult times of the day, making the disclosure of documents appalling. And that's something that we've all got collectively. We've just got to keep companies on the straight and narrow and say, this is acceptable, this is helpful, but this is not a substitute for this other thing. And many voices actually really do make a difference on this. Otherwise, you see the companies think it's just me banging on. Isn't that right,
And I think the important thing is to get individuals the information to be able to vote in the first place. And we do have quite an engaged audience on this webinar today, because 50% have indicated through the polls that they are actively voting at AGMs, and 50% receive information about AGMs, which I would say is quite high. Our experience at ShareSoc is that often individuals do not get the information about their companies and the AGMs. And this comes to how shareholders hold their shares via nominee accounts. And it's the top question on the list here. And it's really about, by requiring data only available to registered shareholders to be able to attend, and that would be nominee accounts. So for example, if you hold your shares in an ISA, that will be via a nominee account, and the nominee receives the information, not you as the individual with the ISA. So what could be done to improve this so that individuals are pushed that information? Cliff, maybe you can add some comments to that before we get other people's views.
Yes, I think first of all, people should have to opt out rather than opt in to receiving AGM information. And that requires a change to the Companies Act. But it also could just be done by best practice, and we will put some pressure on the platforms to encourage them to adopt opting in as the default, as best practice. So that's the first problem. And the question about in the Q&A here, I think there's also another question about Hargreaves Lansdown saying, which if you go to their site, they say that within 5 days they will be able to get you information, but it doesn't happen quite like that in practice. It seems to take a lot longer. We had huge problems with Sirius Minerals and people who wanted to vote their shares, and we reported this to a High Court judge who made a very, very interesting review of it in his summation of the case, and which was input to the Law Commission's review of intermediated securities. So we hope for an improvement in that circumstance. And it does take a long time. I had a problem just recently with Aviva. I went to get a proxy so that I could attend the AGM electronically via a Lumi. It was a Lumi facilitated AGM, which was going to allow voting at the AGM. And the proxy has still not arrived because it's sent to me by post by Interactive Investor. This is just nonsense. It's electronic communication should be allowed, and there should be some facility for instant communication. I think the problem is falling down between the nominee and the registrar. I don't think it's actually the company. So the registrars and the nominees have got to get together and work on this and get it sorted out.
Yeah, Sarah, what are your views on this?
So electronic communications, the e-coms bill, I think is nearly 20 years old now. That's yes. A lifetime ago. And actually registrars have been taking electronic proxy appointments since the mid-90s. So there are no legal or technical barriers for companies to receive electronic proxy votes. What there has been is a massive underinvestment at the intermediary level, and they often cite lack of demand. But if they make it so difficult for you to actually find this information, it is hardly surprising that there is a lack of demand. So you actually had a situation in the mid-90s where there were lots of shareholders who made a big noise about the fact that they were losing their voting rights. And they were promised, oh, don't worry, technology will take care of this. And then a generation of certificated shareholders have kind of passed on and left behind people who've gone into pooled products, where a lot of this is hidden in the small print. And it's extremely disappointing that the platforms have actually gone this route, because certainly in markets like South Africa, for example, to Cliff's point about it should be you opt out from your rights rather than opt in. That's exactly what they did. But there has been a lot of lobbying over the years by market intermediaries to try and simplify the process. But in doing so, they have disenfranchised shareholders. And this is an important fundamental property right. These are your shares. They are your property. Yes, of course, you want efficient dealing, but you also want efficient voting as well. And so it rather seems to have been that short-termism has been encouraged rather than long-term stewardship, which is very disappointing. So Cliff is absolutely right. It should be you are defaulted into receiving your rights. There is no reason for having a piece of paper mailed to you. Electronic voting is available and has been for decades.
Thank you. David, obviously you're an investor in many companies. Is it a big part of your sort of day-to-day making sure that you're registered properly in order to receive the information to vote at AGMs?
Yeah, it is. And, pre-pandemic, I was attending an AGM or 2 AGMs every week. So, I love engaging directly with all the board. It's just what I like to do. And it really annoys me, the fact that as soon as the pandemic came, they hid straight away, pretty much, those who wanted to, hid behind the fact that you couldn't hold a meeting in a room. And I don't understand at all why, when we can do this in a webinar and you can see everyone and you've got all the directors effectively, if you want, in front of you, why can't they, what is preventing them doing a Zoom webinar just the same way as we do for an AGM? Or at least have them all available for Q&A, even if they don't want to hold the whole AGM that way.
Yeah,
it's just
and I think, Dave,
very poor. They hide behind it. Yeah,
and David, Lloyd's are actually doing it quite well. They've got this pre-AGM webinar on the 13th. Their AGM's on the 20th, and they've teamed up with ShareSoc and Yellowstone to have another investors webinar on the 24th. Of May. So I know it's after the AGM, but I mean, if there's any governance issues coming up, people can raise them there. Yeah. And it should be that engagement is an ongoing process throughout the whole.
They're effectively proving it can be done, but 95% of companies are not offering that at all. All they're offering is send a question in by email and we'll have it answered. You don't know who's answering it. You don't know if the non-execs have even seen that question. And you don't know where the reply comes from. Could be just the company secretary.
And it's very different to when we used to go to AGMs. And we met the directors before the AGM and after the AGM, and you had that little chat and you got a jolly good answer. You got an insight.
So we're at a real disadvantage at the moment.
So Maureen, from your perspective, with regards to actually getting the information to the individual shareholder and not just to the registered shareholder, how do you see that changing?
I think that's slightly trickier than the discussion that we were having about changing the virtual meeting piece of legislation. As Chris mentioned, there was a Law Society report that was sent to the Department of Business, I think earlier this year. They're looking at that at the moment, and we're trying to work with them to find out what their plans are to change the law or to do something in this area. We're not sure what they're going to do yet, but what we will do as part of our stakeholder group is we will highlight the ways, the best practice that is going on. And I think it was Cliff that said, we need to put pressure on the platforms to do more. So if we can't get the legislative change necessary, Well, then again, I think again it is about putting pressure on them to ensure that those with the actually hold the benefits of the share are able to vote it if they want to do that. So yeah, we're trying to talk to the department, but in our best practice, we'll be putting something out. I will be highlighting poor practice as well.
I think consumer power here, Maureen, is absolutely essential, is that there has to be competition between the platforms. And I think that they need to know that this is a point of difference, that cost has been a race to the bottom. And actually consumers are much more discerning these days. And in fact, there are a lot of there's a lot of studies that have come out about sort of millennial investors, so people who are just starting to get onto the whole area of investment, have very, very strong views about environmental, social and governance issues, and they don't take note, they don't like the kind of condescending attitude, which I think, David, you were really, if we're going to reduce that down, it's you're being taken for granted. And there's a kind of a supercilious approach to, oh, well, let's not worry about the pesky little shareholders. After all, they only give us the money, don't they? And I think that that attitude really needs to change. So good practice examples like Lloyd's, even though they've been through the mill a bit, you can see they're trying hard. And I think organisations, say, like Marks and Spencer, for example, those who I think are used to dealing with a large retail engagement proposition, understand the importance of engaging electronically. But I do worry sometimes that in the small cap area, where I know that David's got a lot of interests, the advice that companies are given is, shall we say politely, suboptimal. What they are told about what is good, bad or indifferent is probably about 10 or 15 years out of date. So you've not just got registrars to deal with, you've got investor relations consultants, nomads, brokers, banks, stock exchanges, etc. There's a whole range of people that sit between you and your investee company, many of whom have spent the last 25 years telling the companies that you as shareholders don't matter, and suddenly things are changing. But yeah, we could see during going into lockdown, there were some companies that just took to this like a duck to water and just knew instinctively this is the way to go, and others who were just flapping around. And it became a point of embarrassment, really, because the UK was just light years behind other markets who immediately were issuing guidance. Companies were getting with the program, and actually, because one of the questions that's come up in the Q&A is, how come retail shareholders get excluded from results meetings, etc. I think what these electronic media show is you can engage with all of your shareholders, but maybe they just don't want you there because you might ask difficult questions, and that's exactly what's needed. You are there to ask the difficult questions that nobody else will ask. So please, the more David can ask difficult questions, the better.
Yes, and it's a mixture. It's about also those shareholders maybe not even being aware of what's being put on, because the information is going to the registered shareholder, the nominee, rather than to the individual. So it's such an important area. And we've got so many questions. We're running close to time, but just a couple of comments. And I guess it's also about timing, now particularly that we've got the webinar style, if there's an engagement session just 2 days before an AGM, that's not enough time then in order to you can form your view, but to get your vote in the right amount of time. And just to say that on the ShareSoc website, we have these Minerva reports, which Minerva have kindly allowed to share with ShareSoc. You need to be a full member, but there's a question here about smaller companies. So perhaps you could just let us know, Sarah, for smaller companies, are you creating such reports?
Yep, so we're covering probably in the region of 6,000 companies around the world on an annual basis. Regrettably, the demand for small cap research over the years has gone down a lot. and I'm very disappointed about that. We were covering AIM when AIM actually first got going, but what happened then was our institutional investors moved away from AIM. And as much as I would like to write a report every single year for every single company, whether somebody owns it or not, just so that there is actually an archive there of how practices have changed, I'd love to do that, but sadly there aren't enough people who are willing to pay for it. So if there is sufficient demand, we will supply it, and because I think small cap companies, if you can get them on the right road early, as they grow with good practices and good habits in mind. So, and that really contributes to the successful relationship with the shareholders, so that when they come to need a rights issue or something like that, the trust is already there. So I think I'm a great believer in small caps.
Great.
Can I add, as an investment point here, is that if you're going to invest in a small company and they don't treat you very well, if they're the sort of company when the going gets tough, they revert to type, then it's probably a good sign to not invest in that company. You can save yourself a lot of money if that company, because very often the ones who blow up are the ones who have poor governance, and the signals are there. So that was my investment tip of the day.
Well, thank you very much. And we have sadly come to the end of time for our session. So I would like to thank Maureen Beresford and Sarah Wilson, Cliff Waite, David Streder. Thank you so much for your valuable time today. We have many events coming up at ShareSoc. I know there are quite a number of questions in the Q&A, and Amanda, who's our technical manager, if you can please make sure that we save those so that we can make sure the panelists have those, because this is really obviously a subject that we need to come back to and perhaps do a follow-up webinar. And if you are interested to read more of the Minerva voting guidance, that is available to full ShareSoc members. So please consider joining. Thank you all again to the panelists for your time. Thank you to the attendees, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Goodbye.